Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Una, and we have Sony here today. I'll kick off with telling you just a little bit briefly about Established Form. The format of our presentation will be Sony and I will do little snippets of our private practices and how that has sort of converged into Established Form. Here, the art can live off the wall. This was I'd assume, the only pretext we went in when we decided to what we thought would be a small series of a collaboration at the time. We have now become the accidental founders of Established Form, which was not the idea when we started out. As a part of any collaboration, ideally you want to go in with creative freedom, the ability to ask questions, the ability to intercept into the practices of your collaborator itself. We can proudly say that we were able to create a really immersive and honest collaborative experience. Through that, what we have been able to create as a result of that authenticity is driving the uncommon to interact. Sony is a designer and I'm a visual artist. The uncommons there and driving them to truly interact, leaving aside their individual practices and biases and understandings to create something that has its own identity. What that has done in turn is it's taken on a life of its own where it views us and views how we consume this art rather than a more common format of the viewer and the maker consuming the art itself.
So I'll start with my process and how I work in the realm of texture. And so Suruchi gave a really nice introduction, so I won't go too much into that. But I did start House of Sewn in 2015. I moved back to Bombay. So Bombay is home, but I moved back from New York. And this is a place I wanted to be because this is really where I wanted to explore fabric. And that's a really big part of how I do what I do. Fabric is kind of the starting point, I would say, in terms of, every time I go into a collection, the process is different. Sometimes I'll start with an idea, sometimes I'll start with a fabric. And fabric in this country, especially when I first moved back, I traveled all over the country looking at weaves, looking at different embellishment forms, different things to kind of, that make this place special. And it turned out that I wanted a contemporary look and still work with these traditional fabrics in a way, that could be feasible for someone to actually put on, an urban woman, and to live in this world now. And because I don't work with a lot of surface embellishments, embroidery, any of those things, I don't work with anything other than the actual fabric. It kind of started to be, so texture kind of started at this point for me. The other thing with garments is that they flow naturally, and the thing that I wanted to preserve is that feeling and that flow and the texture that allowed me to kind of, using the textures in the fabrics that I would source from all over the country, that kind of allowed me to stick with that. Language is also very important, idea that I wanted to, language actually is how I tell my story. So when I began my design process, a lot of languages come into play. So sometimes when I'm sketching, it's a very visual process. I do a lot of writing in my work, not in the clothing, but in my brainstorming and the way I start out a lot of my collections is through writing, whether it's poetry, whether it's prose. And that kind of is one language that I use. And then texture is a language that shows up. So when someone puts it on and when it's actually worn, that's the language that's actually making it come to life. And so even just for example here, I wanted to explore the idea of movement. And so without using anything but the fabric and but that texture, it's about, I had to challenge myself to say, how do I actually create that using that and create texture using that same material, monochromatic, and still have the viewer have, make it seem like there is a flow. There is something that's happening other than whether it's on the sleeve there or whether it's the actual design elements. And so that was definitely something that I worked with. And with different pieces, different types of texture show up, different ways to use the actual fabric and manipulate the fabric to make it do what you want, whether it's something stiffer, whether it's flowing, how I use the details to kind of, whether it's those little detailing elements that kind of make something really what it is at the end of the day. So, Una, do you want to go into yours?
Thank you. So I am a visual artist. I have been a painter now for, since I was 11, but formally and professionally, I've been in this field for about over a decade now. My work can broadly be captured under the spectrum of gestural abstraction. What's important to note about the scale of the work is that the work is usually large in order to allow for a range of motion. I do not use a traditional wall technique to work. I work off the wall, on the floor, off the stretcher bars, on the stretcher bars. It allows me to interact with the work differently, which brings me to the work is, in a sense, a living entity. We are, when I'm engaging with my work, it is not separate from me, yet it is separate in the sense it's like having a bad hair day. When your hair does not do what you need it to do, the work sometimes just does not relent. There is resistance, and through that relationship, what I've come to see over the last many years is that it's alive. And when it's alive and you're in response and you're having a conversation with your work, you can't predetermine the output. And that is the element of gestural abstraction, where I do not go in with an end in sight. I respond to each form and each color and each texture, as you'll see as I go forward. Another part of my practice, this is a sentence from my statement. What I resonate most deeply with is the last line where it says, "Where nothing, absolutely nothing is wrong." We are constantly engaging and interacting with something at some point, whether that's an internal rhetoric or an external rhetoric. If that is the case, nothing is right or wrong. Most things, they just are. We just be. And so when you approach the world and your life from this perspective that you cannot allocate and box things into right, wrong, in a painting, it's not right or wrong, then you approach work very differently. Human error is not right or wrong. It's the humanity of the person behind the work. Even when work is absolutely perfect, you know there's humanity because there was a decision to make it pristine and gorgeous. This is a much older piece. It is my take on egg tempera. It is egg yolk and acrylic, and egg yolk and acrylic. Bringing this piece up is there was a turning point in my work. At one point while I was working, I realized that I was trying to mimic something internally and in my own personal expression of writing manifesto after manifesto, statement after statement. I was not able to pinpoint what it was that I was truly trying to say or truly trying to mimic through form. I use form and color to layer, which is when I realized that there's an element of folds. There's an element of something folding that is drawing me in, and that's attractive, which is when I decided to shift my focus directly into a far more materially oriented practice of fabric alteration. Fabric alteration specifically, not manipulation, because I do not change the natural nature of the fabric. I work with its resistances. I work with what it is meant to say and do. In some cases, it's painted. In some cases, it's not. But the shift here was that it suddenly moves. If it's off a wall, it no longer exists the way we traditionally have seen painting for a very long time. Here's another example of I guess, once fabric entered. So for the painters in the room, when you are painting, and it's usually paint and canvas and hands to canvas, you realize that when you insert a third entity, it's a brand new relationship. Inserting fabric into my work was inserting a brand new entity. It was not as simple as we now paint. We're painting, the painting here this is an enamel and organza piece. And there has been prior manipulation of the fabric by House of Sewn. And I have then taken the piece of fabric and created it into a painting. again, the essence here is the shift in terms of texture from layering through paint has now become a very vital, obvious element of texture where you can feel and touch, it moves. Here is another example from a very recent collection, and in my opinion, I think really a marriage of paint and fabric, and showing the transition of form to texture to something that's far more three-dimensional and interacts with you very differently. Back to established form. So I already said enough, but I will just quickly say we are a creative collective. A big focus for us is interdisciplinary artistic collaboration and exploration. Just as Sony and I did, with no end in sight, you can really create something beautiful. Edition 1 was art and fashion, is art and fashion. Here we can talk about movement. The piece that you see is wearable art. It's art. It can be worn. It fits in a few different paradigms, and I don't really think it's necessary to make it fit in one particular paradigm. This work is pure fabric, and this is where movement became a big part of the conversation while Sony and I were working together, and the element of texture is pretty critical and obvious since you're working with fabric as is. Texture here is malleable and texture here is static. There is a juxtaposition of the exact same material. It functions differently. It's malleable because it can be worn. It can be twisted, it can be turned, it can be folded. And when our model was wearing it as well, I enjoyed a sense of comfort that she experienced with the work. With artwork, normally we don't touch artwork. We were just talking about that a little bit ago. And here you're wearing the art itself. That said, it is also static in that motion. It really doesn't move. There's a tension and a reverberation that is created within the folds and within the forms. These folds do not come undone. This is the artwork itself. The fabric is the paint in that sense. Here is one more example from edition 1 of a painting that then was taken and created into a dress by House of Sewn. Again, talking about how in the space of collaboration, when you're working with somebody else's work, how do you create a sense of comfort and trust to take a painting, well, for me to take the fabric and make a painting, and for Sony to take the painting and make it into something wearable. You touch on a lot of different things. You touch on preciousness. You touch on how you're consuming the work. This is no longer art on a wall at a distance. And yeah, I'll let Sony take over and continue.
So when we're talking, so even just now when we were talking about our personal practices, it kind of was apparent that we come at texture very differently. And so what was really important when we first started this collaboration was that actual dialogue. And our dialogue happened to happen with art and fashion in my case. And so this initial dialogue, and just to quickly talk about our process, so Una would make a painting, she would give it to me, and I would make a garment. I would respond with it with a garment, respond to it with a garment, and we went back and forth like that. And so that was really that conversation that was happening through texture, because we are working with something that we haven't been used to working with. Una does work with texture, but even just giving her different texture to work with, it was, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but that was a different experience for you altogether. And I feel like, so that initial conversation and that idea that, they don't have to be saying the same thing in order to be talking, that really came out because we were actually conversing in our own language, and it was coming out in whatever art form that we were creating in. And even just looking at this piece here, the way the art represents movement and the way the clothing represents movement it's speaking so differently. It is actually like two different languages coming together. And so this conversation then ultimately came together and became a collaboration. And so here, collaboration is where it kind of turns into a common language. And so going back to that response state where I would respond with a painting and she would, super collaborative. When I would respond with clothing and she would respond with a painting, it kind of became something where she would give me a painting, and then that painting itself became the clothing. And so that was the ultimate transformation, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you.